of Proverbs, the book of Mishlei. We went through the introduction last week, speaking a little bit about what King Solomon tried to do as far as impart wisdom to the Jewish people. We spoke a little bit about his unique background and so on and so forth. And today we're actually going to delve deeper into the text itself and see if we can walk away with trying to understand a little bit of what King Solomon himself tried to impart to the generations that came after him. So he starts as follows. So you could follow, if you're looking at the source sheet, then go all the way down to the bottom. It's the last source. It's source number 3, I believe, or I can't actually see it over here. But 1 second. Does it work like that? Oh no, if you copy. It doesn't say the numbers, but it's the last source on the bottom. It says Mishlei, Proverbs 1-6. Okay, so it goes like this. It says Mishlei Shlomo ben David Melech Yisrael. The Proverbs of King Solomon, the Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, the king of Israel. He is describing himself as being the author over here. And he's telling us very clearly that he is the son of King David. He's just telling us, that's the author. This would be equivalent of written by King Solomon, son of David. So he has our attention. And now he's going to describe, for the next 5 verses, he's going to describe what the focus and the purpose of this book actually is. So he says as follows. He says, Ladat chokhmah umusar, in order to make known words of wisdom and discipline, lahavin imre bina, and to make words of understanding knowable or discernible. So let's break this down over here. So what is he talking about? This is a very short, very terse. So he says something called, he has ladat, chokhmah, umusar. Now, when we talk about chokhmah, musar, and bina, these are the 3 adjectives used in this particular verse. We have to define them and try to understand them. So chokhmah is often translated as wisdom. Okay, now wisdom isn't just the knowledge of it's not the internet. Wisdom is not having access to information. The attainment of chokhmah is the major goal and theme you'll find over here. So the way Rabbeinu Yonah explains it, he says that chokhmah is knowing the way of the righteous, knowing the way of righteous truth and justice, which is a very nice poetic idea. What does that mean practically? So the way that I'm going to be using the word chokhmah is based on the Malbim's understanding of the word chokhmah. And he says that chokhmah is understanding how to choose between 2 opposite courses of action. That wisdom is being able to understand one thing versus the other thing. So for example, when you have to choose between being cruel or compassionate, between arrogance and humility, between brazenness and shame, between eating and fasting, between holiness and impurity. So the correct choice, making the right choice between those different choices is called chokhmah. And its opposite is another word we're going to see King Solomon using over and over again called sichlut, right? Or folly. So for example, as a rule, you always have to act with humility. But when it comes to dealing with fools, the wise approach is to deal with them arrogantly. Right? So there's always going to be exceptions to the rules. Just because one course of action seems the most noble, that doesn't mean that that's the right course of action. So what he's going to be doing, he's going to be telling us stories and share his insight so that he can go ahead and help us be able to discern between what is right and what is wrong. How do I know what chokhmah is? Chokhmah is, according to this standard, based in Mishlei, is the ability to be able to differentiate between making the right choices versus the wrong choices, knowing how to apply the right traits in the right scenario, in the right circumstances. That is what he is trying to get to. Now, he used the word musar. Now, depending on the context, the word musar, right, or musar in the more yeshivish colloquial terms, is translated as discipline or ethical teaching. And sometimes it even means affliction. But Musar also refers to the perfection of midot. And that's the way I'd like to think of it. Musar is about taking recognizing the worst character traits that I may have and figure out how I can become the best version of myself. Chokhmah without musar, wisdom or the search to be able to discern between right and wrong without musar is like it doesn't make any sense. It's like the Vilna Gaon says, it's like a tent without ropes. You need something that grounds you, and therefore chokhmah is just the idea, and musar is the application of that idea. And we'll see this kind of play out a little bit more as we move forward. So you have chokhmah. Interestingly, the Maharal, who is one of my favorites, the Maharal says chokhmah comes in two words, koach and ma, which is the power to ask questions. That real wisdom at the very initial stages of what chokhmah is the power to ask the right kinds of questions. And therefore, when we think about the word chokhmah, we should be thinking more deeply about, how we can articulate our questions. Are we asking the right kinds of questions? Because questions is the key to everything. Now, we can derive chokhmah through three ways. So chokhmah is one through divine inspiration. Okay, where does this information come from? How do I know what are the right ethical teachings? How do I know what I should be doing? So we have something called divine inspiration. And we know that King Solomon was a great chacham. He had nevuah, and the Spirit of God rested upon him. We also have the second way is by transmission, that we have a Mesorah, that there was a Mesorah, which is ultimately another way of just saying God gave us a tradition that was passed down from generation to generation. And the third way we could get chokhmah is through experience, right? Experiencing, making mistakes, and so on and so forth. Now, we don't want to learn chokhmah through making mistakes, which is why King Solomon wrote this book. He wrote it so that when you are living life, you don't have to go through life's, by making mistakes. Instead, you spend the time clarifying through chokhmah and musar what is the right course of action. Everything that King Solomon is expressing here comes from one of these three different branches of wisdom, either through divine inspiration, tradition, or his experience. And he has a lot of all three of those things. It ends with, Shlomo ben David Melech Yisrael. In that first verse over there, again, it says, V'chachem kol adam. We know that King Solomon was wiser more than any other man. He was a prodigy, savant, genius, and so on and so forth. Now, when we talk about the idea of finding wisdom, right? I think it's important, and this is going to be like a little bit of a segue into the next verse. When we think about wisdom, we don't think about Yirat Hashem. I don't have a good way of translating Yirat Hashem, but the most simple way of translating Yirat Hashem would be a fear of heaven, or fear of God, or awe of God. And this is what it says in Mishlei. Later on, we'll see this, the idea that Reshit Chokhmah, the beginning of all wisdom, is Yirat Hashem, is the fear of God. Now, what's the correlation between fearing God and having wisdom? Is there a correlation? And the answer is, yeah, there's a very deep correlation. And the answer, what's the correlation? Correlation is that if you believe that wisdom is something that you find on your own, that it doesn't come from outside, it comes from me. It only comes from experience. It only comes from things that I can measure. You're never going to learn the deepest parts of wisdom. You see, Yirat Shamayim means that I recognize that there is a set of ethical, moral principles that were passed down that are outside of humans' understanding. So therefore, when we speak about relationships, when we speak about building a family, when we speak about building community, I can't use my own faculties to help define and create a vision of what excellence, perfection looks like in those realms. I'm stuck because I'm biased. And therefore, my own biases will always prevent me from truly understanding what I should be doing. And therefore, mankind's perception and vision is always going to be somewhat limited. It's limited to my own experience, my own knowledge and wisdom. But Jewish tradition isn't about just relying on my own wisdom and knowledge. Jewish tradition is about having a 3,600-year-old time-tested set of rules, philosophies, laws that are all meant to do one thing and one thing alone. How do I turn this bag of meat, this earthy, physical thing, into something that is truly exceptional? How do I turn myself into a luminous being? How do I pull out the best parts of what I am and allow it to experience the depth and wisdom of the world of the spirit and the soul? That's what we're trying to do over here. So when he says in verse number 3, he says, Lakachat musar heskel, right? He says to accept wise discipline, with tzedek umishpat umeisharim, righteousness, justice, and fairness, umeisharim, right? We're talking about the ability to live a life of balance and happiness. Who doesn't want that? King Solomon had everything. Remember that. The context of what he's saying here is that this guy had everything. He had money. There's that great line from an old movie I watched as a child with my parents. I don't know what they were thinking. It was a movie called Scarface with Al Pacino. And there's one line, of course, as a 9-year-old kid watching this with my parents, it was Al Pacino telling this to his friend. I forgot his name. And he says, first comes the money, then comes the power, and then comes the women. That was that great Al Pacino line. I'm gonna have a horrible Al Pacino impersonation, so I apologize. But that's the way the world thinks. Money, power equals women, right? Money, power equals getting whatever I want. We don't believe in that, obviously. Money, power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. So all the time. And therefore, we can't rely on just money and power. It moves us. It threatens us. By the way, and I said this in the introduction last week, even King Solomon, having way too much wisdom, being way too smart, corrupts also. So having wisdom without having a system to apply the wisdom is dangerous. Dangerous. I believe this is true for so many of our professors today on campus. Professors that are teaching today all around the country. They have great intentions. They want to, give over very important pieces of information and wisdom, but often these people cross boundaries, and that's because they have their own personal biases. Again, why is a professor giving me his or her opinion about the Jews and the Palestinians? Why is that becoming an issue in physics? Why does my biology teacher need to try to convince me that Israelis are occupiers? Like, why is that happening in biology? Explain that to me, right? When we politicize and make things political and so on and so forth, it ends up destroying things. So let's create a discipline that's focused. The purpose of education, the purpose of knowledge is to be able to apply it, not to get a career. And King Solomon doesn't even speak about careers anywhere here. You'll read the whole book of Mishlei. This is a book of finding wisdom and knowledge, of finding depth and beauty in life, but you'll see nothing here about a career. He'll talk about it later and parenthetically, but we talk about the idea of being able to understand, wisdom, being disciplined, righteousness, justice, and fairness. Why am I looking for those things? I'm looking for those things because ultimately those things will help me lead a meaningfully powerful life. Why? So listen to what he says. He says, look at verse number 4. Latet lepetaim arma. Lena'ar dat umizima. This is a very interesting choice of words he used over here. He says to provide petaim are simpletons, right? The word arma comes from the word arum. The first time we see this word arma used is in the Bible, specifically in the Garden of Eden. It says that both Adam and Eve were arum, they were naked. And the next time we see it being used is when we introduce the snake, when we introduce the serpent. And the serpent comes along and he says, he's known as the nachash arum mikol chayot hasadeh. The serpent is more arum. And it's not translated there as naked, it's translated as clever. And that's the word he's using over here as well. He says over here that to teach cleverness, right? The idea is to give you latet lepetaim, to provide simpletons, arma lenar datu mezima, to teach simpletons with cleverness, a youth with knowledge and design. Da'at umezima, right? So all types of people will benefit from studying this book. That's what he's saying over here. So what is to provide simpletons with cleverness? Now, remember, we said that he teaches his ideas through parables, right? Now, it's funny. I often get this question when I learn with people. Sometimes I have the privilege of going to people's offices in the city and learning with them one-on-one. And often I'll go back and we'll revisit like a particular piece of Bible stories. And when I go through it with them, they're like, they feel so raw. Like, Rabbi, why aren't we taught this stuff in our youth? Like, why do the rabbis hold stuff back? And the answer is they're not holding it back from you. You see, we lack humility in thinking that we should know everything. We don't know everything. And there's always going to be another way of understanding something. So when we go back and we relearn the text that we've learned from our teachers before in our youth, remember that I'm not the same person I am today that I was before. And therefore, when you hear a story, something as simple as, Rockabye Baby. Rockabye Baby is one of the most destructively evil songs ever written that parents sing to their children. It's a song about a selfish parent who was, didn't want to deal with their child and left them unattended in a wild storm at night. And the child in the story, by the way, I'm not sure if you know this, but in this child in Rockabye, the baby dies at the end. Why do people teach this song, this nursery rhyme to children? I don't really know, but it's a horrible story. I think that the reason why we teach it, this is my own, I don't know if this is true, this is my own interpretation of it, is so that when we're older, we recognize that the things that we learned in our youth are meant to be re-examined. That's the only benefit I could think of teaching that song to our children, right? I want them to hear something and say, like, why did they teach me that? Oh, must be that when we're older, we need to go back and review all the things we learned in our youth and try to understand them now as an adult. Yes, Rockabye Baby, On the Treetop is a horrible, horrible song. When the wind blows, the cradle will rock. Then at the end, the baby comes tumbling down and all. It's not a good ending, right? But it's there to go ahead and help us hopefully find the humility to look back and ask ourselves, what am I meant to go ahead and walk away with? No, they're exactly. These children are not hearing the words and putting it together. But we've heard the song for most of our lives, and it's only when I mean, for me, I never thought of it until I had kids, and I started singing it. And I'm like, what am I saying? Like, what am I doing this? Why am I sharing this particular song? And then it became apparent to me that this was something that I meant to reflect on. And I think King Solomon does the same thing. He uses allegory. He uses parables because you could understand it one way as a youngster and a whole other way as an adult. And there's a tremendous amount of depth, which is why this text is something that you have to always go back over and review, because every year that you review it, my friends, you will find new pearls of wisdom, new insights. If you ever open up a page of Talmud, right, you'll notice that there are, you have two mega commentaries on the side, and you have the Talmudic text right in the middle, right? On every page of Talmud, you'll notice there are 4 lines on the two sides of the commentaries before you get to the text of the Talmud. And the reason why our tradition says they did this, as far as their formatting, is to remind you that before you move away from the Talmud, you should review it 4 times. Review something 4 times before you walk away from it. And that's only when you reviewed it 4 times do you have some ability to go ahead and understand it. So Chokhmah has several subdivisions, okay? 2 of which are represented by the Chacham, a wise person, and Arum, a clever person. What's the difference between a Chacham and a Arum? A Chacham, he acquired much of the knowledge, whereas Arum is someone who is shrewd and pervasive, someone who is, who's super insightful. Lenar dat umizima, a youth with knowledge and design. Right now, all these ideas provide knowledge and counsel to a youth who has not studied, and therefore, when we're again looking at the text itself, we are going to go ahead and try to pull out these words of wisdom. So let's see what he continues to say over here. Let's look at number 5. So he says, Yirat Hashem Reshit Dat. Did I skip one? No. I did. Havin mashal u'melitza divrei chachamim v'chedotam. To understand a parable, an epigram, the words of the wise and their enigmas, v'chedotam, the things that are hidden in them. So what is he talking about over here? Now, to understand parables, in order to understand parables, you could understand it in two different ways. One is that there's the basic lesson that the metaphor itself is imparting. And umelitza is the metaphor itself has its own lesson that's entirely separate part from the deeper intent. So when King Solomon teaches us that chokhmah will protect one from a strange woman, that wisdom will protect you from a strange woman. I mean, I wish I would have known this in college, because I kept meeting a lot of strange women in college, and this would have been super helpful back then. So the metaphor refers to the danger of heresy, right? But even the melitza, the literal metaphorical term, teaches us that we have to be aware of immoral women. So there's two different layers over here that's being taught to us. And therefore, each parable has to be understood on more than one level. Okay, you're going to hear them. We're going to go through the parables. We're not going to do them today. But this is, again, this is his introduction to the book itself. So he says, "Divrei chachamim b'chidatam," the words of the wise and their enigmas. Now, the rabbis were not very open to being very forthcoming with ideas. And often you'll find that the more profound the idea, the more hidden it is. And the question is why? Why is there such a tremendous level of secrecy within Judaism? Why not go ahead and just be open and forthright and just tell me exactly what you want? Why is everything like a sir? We're constantly going these circles, stories and layers and layers and layers. And what is it there for? We say that the way a Jew answers a question is with a question. You answer a parable with a parable. We make things so difficult. We're not trying to be. It's just that we're trying to get the truth. And when truth is at risk, we're at risk of losing truth, by the way, which I believe we're losing in this generation so quickly. It's all subjective truth today. There are no real truths. And when as a society, we can no longer agree on truths, that society begins to implode. And I think that we're watching it fray right now. We're watching society peel itself apart, tear itself apart, because there is no truth anymore. We've lost truth. So when you have this idea of words of the wise and their enigmas, same idea as before. On the very simple level, the rabbis are there to teach you information. But it's your job to go ahead and recognize that there's a deeper understanding there. Why? I don't want you to ever think that you will understand this on the most simple level. This is not a subject like mathematics where I need to be clear about 1 + 1 = 2 or the square root of 7 is whatever, right? I'm more interested in you attaining wisdom. And the way we get you to attain wisdom is for you to exercise the most powerful muscle in your body. Okay, number one is your mind. And number two is your tongue. If they have to go, they go in tandem. Your mind and your tongue, your mouth, the way we articulate things, the way we think of things, back and forth. That's what the exercise is. So therefore, yes, I want you to go ahead and do something that's very profound. I want you to ask the question. I want you to review. But more importantly, I want you to have a mentor, which is why, again, going back to the Talmud, what page does every folio tractate of Talmud begin on? Every piece of Talmud, the first page is always page number 2. Why couldn't they put in page number 1? Right? It's not because they were trying to save ink. I know you're thinking they're Jewish and they're trying to be cheap here. They're trying to Jew their way out of it. That's not what's happening here. It starts with page 2 to remind you that the first page of the daf, the first folio of Talmud, in order for you to understand it, you need to have a Mesorah, a tradition that comes from before you. Every single person needs to have a mentor. Every single person needs to have a rabbi, someone that they could go back to, or mentor. It doesn't have to be a rabbi per se, someone they could go back to and find information from them to clarify your understanding, to make sure that you're on the right path of understanding. And therefore, I'm going to write things as as difficult as possible. When you open up Maimonides, any of his works, he wrote his book with the intention of it being written for a scholar. He did not write it for the layman. He did not write his book for the layman. The Talmud was not written for the layman. It was written for the intellectual. And the reason why they wrote this way is because they did not want to risk losing the nuances in ideas. And that's what he's saying over here. He's saying Yishmach, he's saying that Arma lenar dato mizima. I want you to go ahead and think about this with cleverness, a youth with knowledge and design. I want you to understand there's a tremendous amount of depth over here. Don't just go ahead and just take the stuff in and accept it as is. Don't allow yourself to be disencouraged by the enigmas of life. I've had questions that I've been asking for years. I had one particular question that took me about 6 years to finally find an answer that made sense to me. It's okay to have questions. We live with questions. There's nothing wrong with having questions. We want you to have questions. Ask, there's no questions that are off limit. Ask the hardest questions. Never give up on understanding. Never walk away thinking now it's all clear to me, I got it. That's not what he's saying over here. If you want to understand mashal and melitza, parable and epigram, you have to be able to go ahead and understand that there is a depth to everything that life is teaching us in our own personal lives. The circumstances that we find ourselves in can be interpreted one way or another way. We live in a time right now, it's so funny, we live in a tomorrow night's the election, and whoever wins, wins. But what's so interesting is what the responses are going to be. I'm so curious, like, well, what happens if Biden wins? What happens if Trump wins, right? And you can say, Rabbi, who cares? And the answer is no, I'll tell you why I care. I care because the response to the loser gives me an insight into where we are as a society. Tells me a little bit about where we are as a people. And if there are these uprisings and riots that are people, I got text messages, don't go out on, November 4th, it's going to be dangerous. They're going to block the bridges and the tunnels and blah, blah, blah. If that does happen, it reaffirms to me that we've created a narcissistic society. That my protest is more important than your ability, your right to cross a bridge or freedom. I'm not sure if you saw the pictures of Fifth Avenue being boarded up. It comes from a narcissistic society. And when we live in a narcissistic society, again, that society does not care about truth. The first step to wisdom is Yirat Hashem. Reshit Chochmah Yirat Hashem. You know why? Because it makes you humble. If you cannot humble yourself, if you cannot stop for a moment and think about the wants and needs of the other, you cannot find wisdom. You don't humble yourself to find yourself a mentor, you will not understand the enigmas of life. If you don't go ahead and remember, appreciate and feel a sense of gratitude for all the things that you have, and instead all you do is complain about all the things that you don't have, the things you're lacking, you will never find happiness in life either. So he's saying like this, I'm going to do everything on my part. King Solomon's saying, I'm going to do everything on my part to go ahead and give you the tools to find wisdom and knowledge. But remember, in order for you to unlock the tools, you have to have humility. You have to have fear of God. You have to recognize that there's a source of wisdom and information that comes outside of experiential knowledge. It comes through divine nevuah. It comes through Ruach HaKodesh, God communicating with humanity. It comes through Mesorah, a tradition that's been passed down from generation to generation. I don't need to go ahead and make the mistakes of my father and my grandfather, my great-grandfather. I'm meant to learn from their mistakes. I'm meant to humble myself and say, Dad, Grandpa, great-grandpa, teach me so that I don't repeat those mistakes. That's what King Solomon is telling us over here. You want to be part of the Chachamim. You want to be part of the wise group. You want to be part of the people that are looking for truth and wisdom. Then at the very least, find the humility. The first stage first step to wisdom is finding the humility. And through that humility, you will find everything that you need to achieve a level of depth and knowledge and understanding. I want to finish this last verse over here, number 6, and then we'll stop with that. And God willing, we'll pick up from the beginning of the book, because this is just an introduction again to the book. And he says as follows. He says, did I finish it? Yeah, I did. right? The wise may hear and increase his learning, and a discerning one may acquire strategies. Why? To understand the parable, the epigram, the words of the wise, and their enigmas. So you have this last idea. So his job over here is to give you everything that you need to figure out the riddles of life. Life is filled with so many challenges, so many mysteries. Our responsibility is to be committed to finding the humility and the persistence to never give up in finding our answers, finding the truths that we're looking for to make our lives better, because ultimately that's what he wants. Thank you for listening. If anyone has questions, I'll take them now. Otherwise, we're looking forward to seeing you guys next week. We'll continue with verses 7 through 11, the next stage, where he gets into some of the actual pearls of wisdom. This was introduction number 2. Thank you for listening. I look forward to seeing you all, God willing, on Monday night. If you'd like to join us for Coffee Talk on Wednesday at 11 o'clock, or Inspirational Parsha at 1 o'clock on Friday. Have an amazing week. If you haven't voted, please do so tomorrow. Everyone's vote counts. Laila to everyone. Have a great night.